Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you are listening to us on one of the myriad podcast platforms you can hear us on, you know you can always watch us on YouTube, and if you're watching us on YouTube, go and check us out on one of those fine podcast platforms as well. Subscribe, leave a like, leave a review, smash down on that comment button and leave a comment. Let everybody you know in your orbit, your friends, your family members' friends, your friends' family members, let them all know how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour Podcast. Joining me today, very excited to bring him on. His name is Jason Pye. He is the Vice President of the Due Process Institute and has been with DPI, I believe, since 2021. He brings extensive lobbying experience to the team, having previously worked as the Vice President for Legislative Affairs for FreedomWorks, an organization that I've done a lot of work with over the years. His portfolio included significant policy issues such as criminal justice reform and civil liberties. He has contributed to the passage of notable legislation, including the First Step Act and the Fair Chance Act. Before he was with FreedomWorks, he gained experience in various roles, including serving as the campaign social media chair and blogger for former Congressman Bob Barr's presidential campaign in 2008, and working as a legislative director. He has also appeared on major media outlets like Fox News and Fox Business, and contributed commentary to publications such as The Hill and the Washington Examiner. He is a Northern Virginia denizen. He enjoys music, sports, and he works on two podcasts, Reclaiming My Time and the Peach Pundit Podcast. Say that 5 times fast. Jason Pye, actually the Peach Podcast with Jason Pye. I like that. The Peach Pundit Podcast. Jason, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you. I hadn't seen you in quite a long time. And we've actually taken to calling the Peach Pundit Podcast, Peach Pundit the Podcast, sort of like Spaceballs. Love it. Yeah.
Yes, that's like me and Jerry doing Andrew and Jerry Save the World. You know, you have to have these banner names that are out there. And we'll circle back to talking about Bob Barr's presidential run in a little bit. But let's start here because due process is so vitally important. We spent a lot of time talking about it here on this show. It's a subject that doesn't get enough attention, I don't think. I think you would agree with that because obviously you work for the Due Process Institute. Talk about the Due Process Institute and why due process is so vitally important.
Well, it's constitutionally protected right. I mean, this is, the legal rights defendants have are outlined in the Bill of Rights, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th Amendments, all clearly outline various rights we have. Now, there are a couple different types of due process. There's procedural due process and substantive due process. And substantive due process is where you start getting into issues like abortion. We don't talk about that. We don't work on that. We talk about procedural due process. It's okay. A lot of the stuff we work on is ensuring right to a speedy trial, right to access to counsel. One of the things we worked on last year, for example, I think a lot of people don't realize this. In the federal prisons, criminal justice system, public defenders represent 90% roughly of criminal defendants who come into contact with the federal criminal justice system. Wow. And this is a Sixth Amendment right. This is something that's protected by the Sixth Amendment. And what we try to do, what we had to do last year was fight for additional funding for public defenders to ensure that they weren't going to have to lay off, I think 12.5% full-time equivalent employees is what they were looking at having to lay off at the funding levels they were at.
Hold on for a second, Jason. You would understand it if the federal prosecutors weren't busy, right? If we had too many federal public defenders, let me be really clear about this. If there were too many federal public defenders, then you could say, okay, let's lay off the workforce, but laying off 12% of them when they're representing 90% of the defendants out there, that's insane.
Yeah. And this is not an entitlement. This is not like what we're talking about, like Social Security and Medicare, which are programmatic. They're funded based on the number of enrollees in those programs. This is a Sixth Amendment constitutionally protected right. So we had to fight for additional funding. And I'm proud to say that we were able to get about $65 million more for federal public defenders so they could adequately represent the people who are coming in contact with the federal criminal justice system. But the fact of the matter is, we have an aggressive, federal prosecuting attorney's office. They always have been aggressive. About 95 to 97% of cases that come before the federal criminal justice system are plea bargained out.
Yeah.
So there's something called the trial penalty, where if you take something to trial, you're going to get hammered to the extent that you can, and the extent they can get you. So these are all issues, and there are issues like Brady, Brady violations, or the Brady rule, which is basically if a prosecutor has exculpatory evidence, they're supposed to provide that to the defense counsel that could potentially exonerate the defendant. There's mens rea, which is, I don't know if anybody's familiar with mens rea. Criminal intent. There's a belief that I forget the name of the professor from LSU who said this, but he once said that there is not one person over the age of 18 in the United States who cannot be prosecuted for some federal crime.
Right. It's Henry Silverglade. It's the concept of 3 felonies a day. And so, I'm not sure about the order of release, but I think if I understand the order that I'm releasing podcasts right now, last week's episode, we had on Karen Cook, who represented George Jarkissi in his case, that was brought by the SEC against him. And we spent a good chunk of time. I've spent a lot of time on this show talking about the mens rea, the scienter, the intent requirement, right? The general versus specific. And I'm going to want to come back to that. But the idea of the breadth of federal law being so vast that anybody can be potentially guilty of 3 felonies a day, that's a very dangerous place for Americans to be in, especially as you talk about this idea. Well, actually, you didn't talk about overcriminalization, but the idea of overcharging someone to drive them to take a plea agreement. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you look at the potential of, I think Pat Nolan, who's with CPAC in his own case. I mean, they had hung a sentence of, I forget the specifics, but it was like 10 years over his head. And with the goal of forcing him into accepting a plea deal, pleading guilty, he got less time. So you see situations like that where they'll come at you, they'll throw everything at you, they'll throw the book at you, and then they'll say, but if you accept a plea deal, we'll give you, 5 years with a time of supervised release. And that's the situation a lot of people find themselves in. In some cases, it's easier and less costly to take the plea deal than it is to fight for your freedom if you know you're innocent or know that they're exaggerating the crimes or whatever the case may be. There's a really good example of this. You have this woman, I think her name was Sharonda Jones, and she was given clemency or I think clemency under President Barack Obama. She was given a life sentence. She was the only person in a drug ring not to take a plea deal. And they went after her. Same with Alice Marie Johnson, who was given a clemency by President Trump. She was the only person not to take a plea deal, and they gave her life sentence. And she was a first-time nonviolent offender, but she wouldn't take a plea deal. But this is what you deal with in the federal criminal justice system, and there is a need to have some prosecutorial accountability in the federal criminal justice system. And in terms of overcriminalization, Andrew, since you brought it up, I mean, the best estimate we have is there are about 4,500 to 5,000 statutory criminal offenses on the books and at the federal level. These are laws passed by Congress that include some sort of that are federal crimes, misdemeanors or felonies.
Sure.
And then you look at the regulatory side of the equation, and there are an estimated 300,000 offenses that carry 300,000 regulatory offenses that carry some sort of penalty. And there is legislation that's been introduced by Chip Roy and David Trone, just bipartisan. It's called the Cut the Crimes to Count Act, or Count the Crimes to Cut Act, excuse me. And that was just recently reintroduced. And all it does is just require a complete accounting of the number of statutory and regulatory offenses, the maximum length of the penalty, that they carry, and then how many times they've been used in the past 10 years. So we need to get an understanding of this. And the last time that the Congressional Research Service, which is sort of the research arm of Congress, tried to count this, they came back, I think it was in 2012 or 2013, and told the House Overcriminalization Task Force, which was headed by Jim Sensenbrenner at the time, that they didn't have the manpower to complete the task.
Right. That's the issue. It's the same thing. It goes with an audit of all the property that the federal government owns. And there's something to be said, right? We can all agree that if you're in an environment in which you don't know exactly how many laws carry criminal penalties on the books, you also don't know how much property the federal government owns. Maybe just maybe the federal government is a wee tad too large. Right. I mean, the concept of too big to fail. I mean, it's made manifest here. Let's talk about this for a second, Jason, because you bring up the fact that it was Chip Roy and David Trone together on this. We've really seen, and actually I shouldn't say it's so recent, because I would say probably about 15, 20 years ago, I was part of an overcriminalization task force that was put together by the Heritage Foundation. Weirdly enough, the Heritage Foundation. But we are at least seeing a latter-day renaissance in efforts on both the left and the right to deal with some semblance of criminal justice reform. Tell us why that's happened. How did we get to that point?
Well, I mean, I think everybody realized, one, you had this movement in the states that really started in Texas to address the cost of corrections. Corrections costs were adding up. They were facing about $2 billion in immediate costs, like the next 5 or 10 years in Texas. And then the chairman of the committee of jurisdiction was Jerry Madden. He asked the then Speaker of the House in Texas what he should do, and then the Speaker told Madden to stop building new prisons. They cost too much. So they started focusing on recidivism reduction, which is recidivism being, depending on how it's defined in the jurisdiction, can be the rearrest rate or the reoffense rate of the people who have come out of prison or come out of the criminal justice system, and to focus on recidivism reduction. And that's what they did. And they lowered their recidivism rate. Last time I looked, it was around 21%. I think it was reconviction, which is great. And they averted in total about $3 billion in costs. And you saw this push at the federal level beginning in about 2013 for corrections or prison reform, and then also some sentencing reform. And these were spearheaded by different senators. You had Senator John Cornyn and Sheldon Whitehouse, who focused on corrections reform, and you had Dick Durbin and Mike Lee, who were focusing on sentencing reform. But we weren't able to get anything done until 2018 with the passage of the First Step Act, we just got a new report, Andrew, on recidivism rates in the First Step Act. And I have a blog post coming out hopefully this week at DPI, Due Process Institute's website, that will dive into this. But the recidivism rate of the nearly 45,000 people who have been released under the First Step Act is 9.7%. And that's defined by rearrest. Yeah. That is phenomenal.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, we need more time. We need more data. We need we need more. But if you compare it to what BOP boast a recidivism rate of between 43 and 45%. Wow. So we're at 9.7. Yeah. So comparison, and I'll have charts. Yeah. I'll have charts that show that in this blog post. But I'm telling you right now, First Step Act has been successful. Unfortunately, we saw because of the spike in crime in 2020 related to the pandemic, we saw a lot of people back away from criminal justice reform and not being as popular of an issue. But the good news is 2022 was the fourth lowest crime rate we have seen since 1991. The 2023, the preliminary data looks like crime will decline again, violent crime and homicides. And then the first quarter of 2024 is also very promising, double-digit declines across the board. So very, very good news.
But let's also talk about this in terms of the fact, and this gets into the core issue of both, and I know you don't do with substantive due process, you guys are more procedural due process, but the issue of the abuse of power. Now, you and me both having, orbited in conservative and libertarian circles over the years, you and I both know that the greater the power that any government entity has, the more apt that power can be abused. Again, getting into the Silverglade, 3 felonies a day theory, there was at some point a realization. Well, actually, let me take a step back there, Jason, for a second, because the way I used to frame it for folks is someone gets an idea that there's a problem that a public policy has to solve. So it starts with doing some kind of a pilot program to study it. And then once the pilot program is complete, the next step is to engage in some sort of regulation. Then it's some kind of regulation that carries some kind of, with no penalties, and there's a regulation that carries with it civil penalties. And ultimately, it comes with some kind of criminal penalties, because that's the way we do. We're always ratcheting it up there. And at some point, well, conservatives have always held a kind of a skeptic's view of regulation, while the left for a very long time, though I think less so now, was skeptical of government abuse of power. But now at some point, the right realized that when that you have that enormous power, that can be abused vis-a-vis individual rights. I would see that also is part of what's driven the right's greater interest in criminal justice reform. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think to looking at the left and the right dynamic that you mentioned. Yeah. I mean, I think the left is concerned about abuse of power when Republicans are in charge, and then Republicans are worried about abuse of power when Democrats are in control. Someone like me, who's whether you want to call me a libertarian or a classical liberal, I tend to use the latter term these days to kind of explain my political views. But I kind of look at both parties as being a problem. And you mentioned, in my lengthy biography earlier, that I worked for on Bob Barr's presidential campaign back in 2008. And Bob had this quote, and it's one I've used frequently over the course of my career in politics. Is Bob said during a House Judiciary Committee in 2008 that each president comes into power taking the power left by his predecessor as a floor and not a ceiling, meaning that they're going to expand upon it, and then the next person is going to expand upon it. And that's basically been what presidential power, executive power, has been particularly since the New Deal, or since FDR. It's this dramatic increase in executive power, which is correlated with a dramatic increase in the size and scope of the federal government. And that's something that should concern everybody, particularly conservatives and libertarians. But there's this new breed of conservative I see that's not really afraid of governmental power, which sort of like national conservative, that really sort of irks me. But that being said, I mean, it's something that that should be of concern no matter who is in power. And thankfully, you have like the Supreme Court overturning Chevron, which will help mitigate some of that. But there's still a lot more the court and Congress should do.
But something because you talk about the Supreme Court, not just the Loper-Bright decision, but let's talk about this Jarkissi decision, because this was, I would think, seminal to the work that you're doing. Where you have these administrative agencies, and we've spent a lot of time talking about this, not just with Karen Cook, but with Jessica Malugin and Ryan Young from CEI, et cetera. The idea that you have, these executive branch agencies that have their administrative law courts, and they used to be just engaged in civil inquiries, civil administrative cases. Then after Dodd-Frank, they were, at least as far as the SEC is concerned, given the power to engage in criminal prosecutions with a very different standard of evidence and a very different sort of rules of procedure. And the Supreme Court thankfully said, no, this is not right. You can't do this anymore. But still, when you have agencies like the FTC that has never lost a case, even if it's not criminal, never lost a case in its own administrative courts, the SEC has only lost 10% of their cases. I mean, that's a real imbalance of power, isn't it?
No, it really is. And it's funny, the SEC case, I was actually, I had a meeting at the Sentencing Commission the day that case came down. So I had gone to Ebenezer's in DC to have coffee before I went over the Sentencing Commission and drove the bike I was on right past the SEC, because it's on the same road.
Sure.
But I remember I snickered to myself when I drove by. But no, I mean, I remember seeing, and I'm sure you saw this too, Andrew, some of the reaction of progressives on Twitter related to the Jarkissi case, and and there were rightly conservatives who were saying, imagine being upset that
Right.
at these sort of like kangaroo court type proceedings are getting shot down by the Supreme Court. Imagine being upset about that. Imagine being upset about the demand for due process, which is essentially what the court has said.
Right.
And look, I take. And I'll say this generally because I try to be as bipartisan or nonpartisan as I can in my role at Due Process Institute. So I take no position on the underlying issues in the case. I'm not familiar with them anyway.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the legal issues, the constitutional protections that we all have, outlined in the Constitution, decades of court precedent, I am not upset at what the Supreme Court did.
Well, which gets to a really fundamental question, a fundamental philosophical question. And I want to come back to the issue of intent and those kinds of things and these administrative courts. But, it's not outlandish to say that our entire not just our entire criminal justice system, but in no small measure, the entire constitutional republic rests on the idea of protecting individual rights. And when it comes to criminal proceedings, to make sure that accused criminals are afforded the widest swatch of protections to protect their rights, because the founders understood how easy it was to abuse those rights. Somewhere we've lost that idea. Again, I know you're not being partisan and you're not wanting to take sides in this, but and maybe this is right, it's both the left and the right. Somewhere we lost this idea that this entire system rests upon this idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. And it stems from there that we want to extend the fullest manner of protection to those accused of crimes. Your thoughts?
No, you're 100% right. And we are all innocent until proven guilty. It is a bedrock principle of our criminal justice system. And it's not just that. I mean, this is something that has, which is based on like English common law. I mean, it goes back centuries, if not longer. I mean, so we're talking about we as a society, there's what the legal view of how someone who's accused of a crime is, and then the societal view, which is to cast judgment immediately.
Sure.
And I really wish, and some of this is the way the media handles stories, because the media has a vested interest. Bad news sells. Media has a vested interest in getting viewers to tune in or getting clicks, and I understand that. But I also think it's irresponsible, and I think it's irresponsible for most of us to sit here and say that someone is guilty or not. And look, we've all done it. I've done it too. And I'm not saying this is my mea culpa. I've done it. I'm sure you have too, Andrew.
Sure, of course.
But it's something we need to be better about as a society, because people who go through there's a reason we gave criminal defendants protections in the Constitution, because of the experiences of the founding fathers at the time of at the time of independence, and through and what their experiences were fighting or dealing with an overbearing monarchy from the king. So, I mean, this is otherwise you're dealing with kangaroo courts, and I'm not okay with that.
Right. And it's funny because I've long talked about the fact, and normally I only talk about the first part, that I came to my sort of conservative beliefs via being ardently anti-communist, right? I was studied the Soviet Union. I was very feared of centralized government power, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. But, a lot of it gets mitigated by or checked by also my deep and abiding concern about government power run amok, right? Mm. Which gets into the more small L libertarian impulses that are there, and the protection of individual rights and the protection of these things like due process, fairness, right? And the left, again, not that I want to get into a left-right, more of a left-right thing, but there are certain folks that define fairness and justice in a very different way, right? The new definition of so-called equity. But to me, it's always been about this idea of everybody being treated according to the rules that are enshrined in the law. I'll never forget it. Somebody, when I was a kid, somebody very close to my family was accused of something at her work. And I don't remember the specifics of it, but I just remember feeling outraged that her rights weren't being protected. And that's all too frequently what happens. So whether or not it's, nowadays, whether or not it's someone on a college campus being accused of something and sort of being drummed out and have these sort of kangaroo courts that don't protect individual rights, or someone being, dragged before an unfair administrative proceeding, or someone having the law used against them because they happen to have a particular political initial, after their name. This is a serious issue. In fact, let me use that as an entryway into talking about this issue of intent, because again, talked about this with lawyer for Jarkizy last week. I've talked about this with former assistant attorney generals of the United States, attorneys general of the United States, senior prosecutor, anyway, lots and lots of different lawyers who are much smarter than I am. And I'm not a lawyer, to be really clear. But we have seen over the last 50 years the steady erosion of the concept of specific intent. Used to be you'd have to know that you were committing a crime, and you had to affirmatively make the decision to violate that law in order for it to be a specific intent. Now, you just have to know that you were generally doing the activity you were doing, and therefore you could be charged criminally. This is a problem in America, isn't it, Jason?
No, it is, and this is because Congress has developed a proclivity of creating laws that are strict liability, meaning there is no mens rea protection in there. And it was the same LSU professor. It wasn't Harvey Silverglade. It was somebody else. I just cannot think of his name. Who talked about that there are prisons across the country that have innocent people in them, who broke a law that they didn't realize they were committing. And then you have Harvey Silverglade, who you mentioned this earlier, the 3 felonies a day concept, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with Harvey Silverglade, you can buy that book on Amazon for relatively cheap. And he posits on the theory that Americans commit 3 felonies a day, often and unknowingly, in fact. But when you're dealing with any Congress that focuses on strict liability, no mens rea protection, or lacks mens rea protection, that creates a problem where you have a nation of criminals. I mean, and I don't mean that in a
bad way. No, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it's hyperbolic, but that's just why that there's not a person in the country over the age of 18 that hasn't committed a federal crime. So we've got to figure out a way to look, when the Constitution itself mentions 3 crimes, treason, bribery, and piracy. The first, I think it was Ken Cuccinelli who once told me that the Federal Crimes Act, which was passed in like 1790 or 1791, added like 17 or 18 crimes in federal statute. But so you go from 3 to 17 to almost 5,000.
Yeah.
And then you don't know how many of those are strict liability. You don't know how many of those have, maybe a lax mens rea protection. There have been efforts in Congress to create a default mens rea, to place a mens rea in where the statute is not specifically strict liability. Those efforts haven't moved. That was once championed by Orrin Hatch. Now it's championed by Senator Lee. But the problem is, and this is one area where I will criticize the progressives, because the progressives fight us on it. And that's largely because of financial crimes and environmental crimes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were continuing. I was agreeing with you. I mean, my early background was on the environmental side of it, and the learning that, people could be charged criminally with violating the Clean Water Act when they were just doing their job, and they didn't know.
You mentioned that one, Andrew, and there's a case out of DC where you have this gentleman who was dealing. He worked at he was a maintenance man or had some sort of job at a retirement home in Northwest DC. They were having a sewage problem. He followed SOP and directed the flow to Rock Creek Park, which is what he was supposed to do. Rock Creek Park is a tributary to the Potomac River. So he was convicted of violating the Clean Water Act, and he has a criminal record now because of it. And he's just one of many, many, many examples of people who unknowingly broke the law.
So let me ask you this, because it raises the question again. We've been talking about federal public defenders. What is it about federal prosecutors that they would go after a maintenance worker at a home like this who was just doing his job? Why him? Why? I mean, is it just because they need to have a lack of a better term, a scalp in all of this? You get it when you have political targets. We don't want that, but at least you understand it. But why some working class guy like this? Why is he the one who gets the blame for it?
Yeah, and last I heard, that gentleman was working now at Gallaudet University in D.C.
Yeah.
I think, at the state and local level, when you're dealing, well, at the local level, when you're dealing with an aggressive district attorney, it's most likely that they have some sort of political ambition.
Right.
They or an ADA, an assistant district attorney who has some sort of political ambition. The ADA wants to be DA. The DA wants to be a state legislator or a county commissioner or maybe run for Congress.
Right.
You see those sorts of ambitions, and the same is true at the federal level too. I mean, you have assistant U.S. prosecutors, AUSAs is what we call them, who are looking to move up to being a USA, a United States attorney, or maybe they're looking at running for office somewhere, or something, or maybe a state and local office. I don't know, or federal office. But a lot of it's driven by some. It's just they want to prosecute anybody who's who throws their gum on the sidewalk. I mean, there are people in the system who just want to lock up the litter bugs. I mean, that's just but that's not a majority of them. But there are many of those who are like that. But it's unfortunately just the incentives of the system are set to reward prosecutors who overly aggressive prosecutors. And look, and I am not going to say there are crimes that need to be prosecuted. I am not saying otherwise. Obviously, crimes against persons. We've decided as a society to prosecute drug crimes. I think, I personally think marijuana should be legal. I don't do it. I'm a terrible libertarian, Andrew. I don't smoke weed.
Oh, there you go. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that ruins my libertarian credibility immediately.
Right.
But there's something I want to go back to, because you mentioned equity earlier, and I am very, very, growing up in Metro Atlanta, very sensitive to racial issues.
Sure.
Especially, also playing punk rock at a time in the 90s when everything was about unity and the punk rock movement. I do think when people commit crimes, yes, they should be held accountable for committing those crimes. But I do think judges and prosecutors need to spend time looking at the circumstances of a situation to determine the length of a sentence. And something that's really missing in our society and in the debates about public policy is empathy. Empathy is not acceptance, and I'm not saying it's acceptance. It's understanding. Right. And we need to have an understanding about why people create.
But time out for a second. Hold on. I mean, but that's part of the reason why we nominally in America have this concept of being tried, or being judged by a jury of your peers. Not, at least in theory, right? Your peers are supposed to demonstrate that empathy. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're right. But if you're being charged for certain crimes, like if you're someone who like an Alice Marie Johnson, who doesn't want to take a plea deal because you don't think you've committed the crimes that the prosecution is charging you of, you're not. Most juries are, unless the jury instructions are different, you're not going to be able to be sentenced for something less. Yeah. So you missed your opportunity for that. So and I say all that to say, I would hope, because there are, no matter the race, people who deal drugs or traffic drugs who are addicted themselves to illicit substances. There are people who from certain areas of the country, think inner cities or Eastern Kentucky, for example, who just, these rural areas that don't have a lot of economic opportunity. And I'm not justifying it. This is not justification. They committed a crime. They need to be punished for that crime. But we should look at punishment that is, we should take personal circumstances more into account when deciding what a punishment is. Unfortunately, things like mandatory minimums don't allow us to do that. But
and zero tolerance and 3 strikes policies. I mean, we invariably, when I've done radio in Baltimore, at least on my old show, there's always this push-pull between, well, we need more policing, but we also know we need more prosecuting, which, in certain ways we do. But, you have some folks who are saying, well, lock them up in Baltimore. But on the other hand, right, we also understand that that when you don't do anything to rehabilitate people in prison, the output is terrible. In fact, let me use that as an opportunity to open up the door about the importance of second chances, right? And because this is so vital, because we also do a really bad job in America of, let's say that you are someone who has been incarcerated or convicted of a crime and you want to become a model and upstanding citizen, and yet we say that you're given a second chance, but you're really not, are you?
No, I mean, first of all, 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record. And that doesn't necessarily mean prison time. It just means a criminal record. They've had contact with the criminal justice system, state, local, or federal. So when you have a criminal record, particularly if you've been convicted of a crime, it is very, very difficult to come out of prison and live a crime-free life. Right. This is something that sort of drives me nuts when I listen to the people who oppose a lot of the second chance work that we try to do, because you're essentially acknowledging that you don't want this person to have a pathway to live, to get out of maybe the cycle of crime and violence that they've always known or whatever. And that's sort of frustrating. So we focused on legislation like the Clean Slate Act, which is currently pending in the House. And if you want bill numbers, I'm happy to give them to you.
Don't worry about that now.
So the Clean Slate Act deals with federal crimes. I mean, and it's very narrowly tailored, very specific to certain crimes, but it would allow an individual to seal their record. Now, the record still would be accessible to law enforcement in the courts. Right. So if they ever come back in contact with the criminal justice system, that record will be seen, and potentially, if necessary, they could be sentenced to recidivist penalties, like 3 strikes or whatever the case may be. There's the Fresh Start Act, which provides grants to states to do essentially the same thing, record sealing and expungement. The Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act, which deals with simple possession of controlled substances. Currently, you have to be under the age of 21 to be eligible for expungement of a simple possession offense at the federal level. And we're talking about a few hundred people a year. Right. But the Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act would get rid of that age restriction. Unfortunately, Rick Scott is holding us up in the Senate. And then, one other thing I'll touch on is you talked about Baltimore and more policing and things like that. It's something that gets overlooked in a lot of the conversations we have about crime and criminal justice. I'm trying to get my friends on the Hill to understand this. Do you know what the arrest or the clearance rate, which is arrest rate for homicide, is in the United States?
No.
49.4%.
Wow.
Assault, 42.2%. Kidnapping and abduction, 53.5%. Sex offenses, 22%. Let's see. Drugs is actually really high. It's 76.6%. Pornography, obscene material, 20%. So what I'm telling my friends on the Hill is, instead of creating new crimes,
right,
let's enforce the ones we already have.
Sure.
And let's encourage state and local and federal law enforcement to make arrests. The reason people do not commit a crime, they're not afraid of committing crimes because of the offense. They're wondering how likely it is they're going to get caught. Right. And according to this, the clearance rates for murder, 1 out of every 2 cases results in an arrest.
I don't know. You were around. There was a crazy murder case in D.C. back in the early 2000s. Attorney for Radio Free Asia was someone I'd gotten to William and Mary with. Who he was staying in the home of other people. Another person I went to William and Mary with, and was murdered that night. And the guy who he was living, it was the guy whose house it was, of one of the 3 people charged, and it wound up. I was shocked. We all thought it was an open and shut case, but no, he wound up getting off, which was just crazy. I mean, and actually technically never charged with murder, only charged with obstruction of justice. And it's a I'm sorry, I completely digressed there. Jason. Let me ask you those. Let's shift gears a little bit to sort of happier thoughts. So we do this, and I explain this. My listeners all know about this. I was originally conceiving of doing a show called Outside Interest, which you would have been a perfect guest for. You know, the idea of talking to folks in the policy and political world about the things that they do that are not policy and politically oriented. You were in a punk rock band in the 90s in the Atlanta area. So let's talk about some of your outside interests, and then we'll get into the podcast. But do you still play music? Who were your influences?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So I have a couple interests that I spend a lot. First of all, I mean, my fiance and her daughter, I spent a lot of time with them. Her daughter's 8. We actually just got back from Disney World a couple of weeks ago.
I just did a Disney trip. When were you at Disney?
The week of the 8th.
Okay. I was there in middle June with I ruptured my Achilles tendon in April. Oh. So I did 40 plus miles at Disney with a boot on, which was not fun.
Yeah. My fiance, because she just had ankle surgery. So she was riding a scooter the entire time. There you go. Yeah. And I've got my Haunted Mansion,
very nice
sweater on, but no, I mean, so I still play music. I own, you can see these behind me. If you're watching, I own 15 guitars.
Wow.
And I still write and record music at home, for fun. The name of my project is Make Good Trouble.
Okay.
And then I play in a cover band with a few friends up in the DC area. We get together and we played a few shows. We were hopefully going to play some more soon. We cover 90s and 2000s alternative rock mixed in with some punk rock and stuff that we grew up on. Influences pretty well, not diverse, just like along different genres. I grew up listening to a lot of MXPX, the Get Up Kids, Thrice, NoFX, No Use for a Name. And then a little bit more heavier stuff like Training for Utopia, Norma Jean, The Chariot. So I grew, and then another interest, I this is weird considering my lack of religious viewpoints, is I study a lot of biblical scholarship for fun. Which is weird because I am an atheist. So, so it's a lot of fun. It's just an interesting subject to me, finding out why people believe certain things. And then
did you overlap at Freedom Works with Tabitha Hale?
No, but I know Tabitha. It's been a long time since we've seen each other, but I know Tabitha.
Yeah. But no, my point is she was in the music industry before she got involved. So anyway, that's why I bring it up. Sorry,
Hannah Cox, who you may know on Twitter. Hannah was also involved in the music industry for a while too. That was what she did. When I first met her, she had just stopped doing that. But no, those are sort of musical or not musical interests, just general interest I have. Yeah. Obviously, during baseball season, I'm watching the Atlanta Braves. During college football season, I'm watching the Georgia Bulldogs. I've become quite knowledgeable about Disney movies in recent history.
See, it's funny as you know, was with me, it was always, I judged the Disney movies by how good a nap I got on them. I loved going to see Disney movies in the theater because I would invariably have the most glorious naps. Frozen was like perfect. It's funny because we did the Frozen ride at Epcot Center.
We did,
and my girls were like, well, you know this, you know that. My girls are now, college, one is out of college, the other one's in college. I'm like, no, don't remember any of it. I know that there's a snowman and I know there's a girl who can freeze things, but beyond that, oh my God, what a great nap. And boy, I wish I could take one now. So yes.
I mean, I've gotten pretty familiar, like Moana and what were some of the, I'm blanking on other movies.
It's Moana, Lilo and Stitch, Pocahontas. It's Lilo and Stitch, obviously. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Lilo and Stitch. Reagan, my future stepdaughter, is. I actually have a mini stuffed Stitch here in my office. So we buy her Stitch stuff like crazy.
Nice.
So those are sort of like that. But I am excited to go see the new Deadpool movie that comes out on Friday.
we have our tickets and we're ready to go. So let me ask you this: tell us about the two podcasts.
Well, Reclaiming My Time was a podcast I did with Nathan Lemur. We actually shuttered that, and I just haven't updated the my bio yet.
Shame on you. Okay.
I know.
Shame on me for not reaching further, but okay.
No. That's my fault. It's I haven't taken it off, and thanks for the reminder for that, by the way. But the other one, the Peach Pun of the podcast, is something that we started doing during the pandemic. That was there was this website that a bunch of us had started years ago. actually founded by Eric Erickson, called Peach Pundit, and it's back online, peachpundit.com, and it's just about Georgia politics is really all it is. But we decided to take the during the pandemic, when we relaunched Peach Pundit, we decided to take the website and turn it into a podcast with an audience that was really catered to Georgia politicos, state legislators, things like that. And we've, I haven't looked at viewers or listenership in a while, but my understanding is we're doing pretty well. We have a number of Patreons who or patrons who subscribe or contribute through Patreon, enough for us to cover our costs and then help pay some of the contributors to peachpundit.com, or as we say, Peach Pundit, the blog.
Yes.
But it's me and two former state legislators, Scott Turner and Buzz Brockway, both of whom are conservative Republicans. Name. Yeah, his real name is George, but he's also
Buzz Brockway. You can't beat that. Yeah,
yeah, and he actually is a Georgia Tech fan, so which makes for interesting banter on the podcast, considering I'm a Georgia Bulldogs fan.
Sure,
but I'm the moderator, main host, and then these guys, we all sit around and talk about politics. Scott and I tend to argue a lot, to the point where I think sometimes Scott gets mad at me or I get mad at him. But it makes for, if you're from Georgia or have an interest in Georgia politics, it makes for an interesting podcast. We have a lot of fun with it, and we try to do it weekly. I'm mostly successful doing it weekly.
Excellent. Yeah, I know. Believe me, that is the scheduling of these things is just insane. Jason, how do folks find out more about the Due Process Institute?
So you can go to our website, idueprocess.org. You can also find us on Twitter at idueprocess, and you can follow me on Twitter at Pye, Pye, which is my last name. And look, appreciate you having me on, and appreciate the interest in Due Process Institute, and love to talk more about this stuff anytime you're willing.
Without a doubt, it's a vitally important issue. Jason Pye, thank you so very much for joining us. That was Jason Pye, of course. He is the vice president of the Due Process Institute. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please hit the like button, the subscribe button, comment if you want. If you're watching us on YouTube, check us out wherever fine podcasts are found. If you're listening to us, you can watch us on YouTube. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.